Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2022, the ongoing biennial series. Today, we have two wonderful guests, Lucia Pietroiusti, curator, who we will talk to her at length in the first half of the event, and also Anne Barlow. Thank you both for joining us. Anne is a museum director. She's not representing in this event the museum that she directs, but she is a museum director. She has led many fantastic art institutions. And she's also a member of the editorial committee for the past journal of the International Biennial Association. So it's very, appropriate that she's here, and she will be the respondent in the second half of the event. We will also have time for questions and answers from you, the audience. And once we get to that part, I will review how to do that. Briefly, Lucia, Pietroiusti is the curator of the General Ecology at Serpentine's Galleries in London, a fantastic program that you'll hear more about. And she's also the Golden Lion Prize winner of the most recent, Venice Biennial for the project that she did in the Lithuanian Pavilion. So we will talk at length about that project. And she has curated many international projects. But I think for this context, Lucia, I am really grateful that you could join us. And I think basically the previous events we've had in the series, we've talked about biennials at large, specific trajectories of international curators, but we haven't had the chance to really focus on one project, or two succinct, granular projects. And I really wanted to make sure that we can pay attention to what you did in Venice with the Lithuanian Pavilion. It was, of course, a massive success, but it was kind of an unexpected success. I don't think expected what happened, because it was a very unusual project, not just for biennials, but for visual art. It wasn't what people would have expected from a visual art biennial. And I have to confess, I sadly missed it. I was in Venice for the last week of the closing of the Biennale, and I walked all the way there. I didn't read the notes that it got closed already. And I felt a little bit lost. And then I saw this sign saying, but I think that's part of what we can talk about today, if you're up for it, like the challenges of even putting on such a show and keeping it up for so long, right? When you're dealing with actors and performers. So thank you, Lucia. The first question for you, perhaps, is this question about your project at the Venice Biennial, like how it came about, if you can share any insight into the process, then what happens once it became so successful, and just anything you may want to tell us about it would be great to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Pedro. And thank you also, Anne, of course, and Minyoung in the kind of virtual backstage. Thank you for having me. So the Venice Project was a collaborative work by three artists, Rugile Bargiukaite, Lina Lapalita, and Vaiva Granite, who, when they work collaboratively, they work together on every aspect of a work. This is their second joint. This was Sun and Sea was their second joint endeavor, I suppose. But they do hark from slightly different disciplines. So Lina Lapalita works in performance art and has a background as a composer and musician. Rugile is a filmmaker and theater director, and Vaiva is a writer and a poet. And so when they came together, it falls into opera, no matter how you spin it, because put music and text and stage in the same place, and you kind of get either a musical or an opera most of the time. So the two pieces that they worked on together up to this point, Have a Good Day and Sun and Sea, all kind of broadly fell into that genre, but then changed the genre. I think the genre's, I suppose, conditions quite substantially. So they had developed this work, and out of madness, we thought, sure, why not? It's an open call for the Lithuanian Pavilion. I'd been working with Lina for many years, specifically Lina, having had a completely irrational love for the art scene of Lithuania for years, being completely obsessed. And so I thought, and it was kind of a running joke amongst colleagues, like, oh, one day you'll curate the Pavilion of Lithuania. And so around that time, I remember vaguely, I remember writing to Lina and saying, why don't we just apply to do this piece at the Biennale? And the piece went through a series of kind of reconfigurations in order to be presented at the Biennale. First of all, there was the difficult challenge of finding a space that would allow either a double height ceiling that would allow some kind of building. It was always meant to be seen from the top and from quite high up, like about 5 meters above the stage level. And so finding the right place was quite a challenge. Originally, we were looking for an empty swimming pool, which I think I would have also loved because of kind of piling apocalypse on top of apocalypse in a sense. And the power of that image, which we'll actually do in the future as it tours. But and then we found this space, and one of the first strange conditions of the space was that this unused warehouse basically had this kind of natural balcony already built, so it was kind of it was perfect, but it was within military zone. Now, a big chunk of Venice next to the actual Arsenale, which was military zone before and is now kind of the site of the Biennale, really big chunk of its main kind of fish-shaped 2 islands is entirely closed to the public because it's still used by the Marina Militare, the military, the kind of sea-based military of, so this space, which is quite difficult to find, it's kind of at the back. You have to go around the back, and then it's very difficult to get there. Had never been open to the public, this zone at all, and we've had kind of over the course of the run of the pavilion, we had neighbors from around coming in and going, I've lived here for 40 years and I've never walked in here. And so it created this kind of strange condition of being able to do these like very slight modifications to the fabric of the city, which was another thing that we had to really consider, like how can it be a work that embeds itself into the context of Venice in at least in a mindful way, if not, in a full way. So part of the cast was from the kind of greater Venice area, which in this context actually extended to Bologna. But we worked with, thanks to actually Abache, Benjamin Reichen at Abache, the graphic designers of the catalog vinyl, we worked with the cooperative, a screen printing cooperative of inmates from the male prison in Venice to make the screen print for the catalog, and then opening the zone as a kind of symbolic demilitarization gesture. And there were very interesting and very strange things that happened in those moments, because the military kind of continued to change the parameters of what we were and were not allowed to do in the space, sort of made the corridor from the entrance to the zone, let's say to the entrance to the pavilion, narrower and narrower as the days went by, forbade access to, things like toilets and shower facilities as a punishment for like children from the cast playing in a particular tennis court. I mean, there was all this kind of sort of mini Cold War happening between our landlords essentially and the project itself. And then some beautiful things happened then in the middle of these kind of mini things that are ultimately symbolic, but kind of interesting to sort of sense dynamics. In the middle of all of this, you would have these very strange scenes where like fully clothed military officers walking on one side of a fence, and then like cast members in bikini walking on the other side of a fence. And these moments of crossing, I think, taught us something really important about what the kind of siting of that project in that space really, really did outside of the actual context of the piece itself. Now, the piece, one artwork pavilion, so we had to figure out how to make an exhibition out of it. When you imagine that having 13 paid cast members on stage for what in Venice was actually 8 hours nonstop was a tricky endeavor. Oh no, actually I should backtrack one more thing. the piece was presented in Venice as an 8-hour loop, and that was a decision that we made to take this 1 hour work and transform it into this infinite repetition with tricks such as the cast would start singing and the whole piece would start running before anyone was allowed into the pavilion in the morning. They would continue singing after the last audience members were ushered out, kindly ushered out of the pavilion in the evening. So if you visited, and you were sort of free to enter and stay as long as you liked. So some people stayed for the length of one song and others stayed for five hours, really. And so my impression is, obviously not ever having been an audience member in there, but my impression is that my assumption is that if you wandered in at any point and stayed for a long enough period of time, you would have the sense of a completely kind of static, well, not static, but kind of moving, but place with no exit. It's got something existentialist about it somehow. And that in addition to sort of stacked up on top of this very strange, ominous top-down view that you had, the sort of innocence and somewhat lightheartedness of both the songs and the setting, the kind of joy that you have with like the children and the dogs and the whole kind of population of the beach, let's say, and the underlying sort of climate anxiety of all of this. I feel like it's stacked up.
Yeah, in fact, it's the beach setting, right? That you just, because people who haven't seen pictures, they really have to imagine, right? If they didn't see the piece, like that this beach setting, and it really made me think of like Happiness by Samuel Beckett, where this character is buried in the sand, it's like, or in a pile of trash, depending on the person staging it, And I think, yeah, like what you describe of people being stuck in this loop, in this existential loop seems really powerful, especially also given the wider context of these biennials, where often they exist as these parallel worlds to the place in which they are cited, in terms of the cities where they.
I could share a little bit the context of the piece. So if you imagine that that would be the cast, and that's kind of what your eye line would see. More or less.
There was no engagement with the audience directly, correct?
Yes and no. The cast and the volunteers on the beach were asked not to look at anybody, which you think is going to be hard, but actually when you're down there, you're totally absorbed with, you don't notice. It's something about the play of the light. You don't notice it at all. The stage direction, however, intended for everybody who's on the beach in the moment where the choruses happen to either be singing or lip syncing. So that in the moments in which all of the voices join, you have the sense that the entire beach, whilst doing whatever they're doing, playing, playing cards, like making castles in the sand or whatever, would all be having this like moments of strange magic realism, I guess.
And can you talk a little bit more about that kind of interesting, rich tension between repetition and variation that the piece was so much about? Like within that 8-hour cycle, what were set parts that never change, and what were parts that kept reinventing themselves by the cast? And I think that's a really interesting part of the work too.
Oh yeah. So the libretto and the music never changed at all. So there was like complete, exact repetition. But the strange and maybe uncanny experience that you may have had if you stayed for longer than one loop may have been the fact that the directions on stage are to actually be on the beach and do the things that you would do on the beach. And I mean, this is obvious for the little kids, like, anyone with a 2-year-old knows that the 2-year-old is just going to do whatever they want, but also everybody else. So all of the cast members brought their lunch. Well, we had lunch, but brought lunch on the beach, rested, went off, took a shower, and came back wet as though back from the sea, played, with games and so on. But on this idea of the relationship with the public, actually, there was a way to volunteer, to kind of sign up and spend time on the beach as a audience member. And we did find quite a lot of people who came and saw it and then came back in bathing suits the next day.
That's wonderful.
And then came back and again and again and again, because it was quite a pleasant place to be. I actually found myself the surprise element. I thought it was very funny that you mentioned this, because I really felt it. The first day, I think I counted 17 visitors the whole day over the 8-hour cycles. We were taking breaks all the time. Not that you'd ever know. And then by the third day, there were thousands of people. I mean, really queues. And I found myself actually going to hide on stage, like hop in a bathing suit and actually just going on stage to hide, because it was the only place where things were kind of felt quiet and relatively peaceful.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. You know, and since we only have an hour and we kind of want to keep these conversations also somewhat casual for the audience, I was maybe you can, of course, tell us as much as you want about this project, but I was perhaps thinking to shift to our next topic, which is, on the one hand, of course, you're part of the curatorial team of the Shanghai Biennale, but since that's in progress, it's up to you whether you want to talk about it or not. But you know, what I do definitely want to make sure we talk about is your involvement at the Serpentine, because the whole topic of environmental crisis, you know, climate change, environmentalism, more broadly speaking, is something that you've devoted a huge amount of energy and ideas to, you know. And so at the Serpentine specifically, you've been kind of really leading this project of general ecology. So if I think people would love to learn more about that. But also, how do you see these two? There's the obvious connections between the Lithuanian Pavilion, but there may also be things that evolved over many years that would be great to hear from you.
You mean between the General Ecology Project and the Pavilion?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So General Ecology emerged out of spending a lot of time at the Serpentine beforehand, and then leaving for a year to have a baby, and coming back, having learned all kinds of weird things about existence and my own kind, you know, having just had a sort of brain change, and one of those things, I have a background in kind of gender studies and kind of pro-choice and same-sex marriage activism in Ireland, where I went to college. So there was already a kind of background there in something that is an art, let's say. And the job that I did at the Serpentine before was curator of public programs. So everything time-based, visual art, performance, film, music, dance, but also conferences and so on, the discursive. And so this kind of interdisciplinary field in which, so there was a lot of potentially a lot of scope for those strands to be very research-led. But the reality of the matter was that the structure, such as it was, meant that with the exception of, you know, maybe one project a year, there wasn't actually that space to do kind of long-term R&D, you know, really kind of slow work. However, there was a precedent at the Serpentine, because the Edgware Road project, which is much more involved with kind of civic research and socially engaged social justice, had been doing that for about a decade beforehand. So when I came back and had discovered this mysterious insight around like interspecies communication via communicating with an infant through the method of care and responsibility and obligation rather than language. And thusly having this entirely new kind of notion that actually communication is not really about translate. We might get an AI that can translate orcas, but that actually like responsibility, obligations in the way that Elizabeth Povinelli kind of speaks about, and care are the forms of communication with a more than human. So that was kind of insight number one from this experience of being away. And insight number two was about time, something around sort of taking responsibility for a time that is longer than my own life. And if you make that tiny shift, then actually the sort of cognitive shift that you need to make like longer time is not a million miles away, or at least you can kind of start to intuit. So I started to write a project for the Serpentine that would essentially necessitate a transformation of the role to be kind of obsessively and continuously and forever dedicated to ecology. And I proposed this bizarre job title, not so much to just have a cool job title, although that was also, you know, obviously always fun, but more to kind of begin at the smallest point of agency with a structural change, like begin to really try and see, like, if you just propose it as an offhand thing and it's no big deal, can you actually grow a general ecology department out of this project? Like, can you commit time to it, again, past the point of your own being there, hopefully, you know? And so there was this, so the idea of the general ecology project originally was, I don't know if the idea was this originally, but looking back, I think this is the structure of it. And I think of it like a tree in a forest. So there's the visible tree, the stuff that you manifest publicly, meaning like programs and projects and kind of events. Obviously, I had the agency and the kind of year-long budget. There's very practical things to this, but like I had the agency to program public programs, so that was a very good place to start. And obsessively around ecology, you know, like we do a show about something and then you had kind of a semi-independence around what to program, semi-responsibility to do something related to it, find the way that it relates to the environment and somehow do a program about that. So there was a little bit of like, do it again and again and again and again and again. And eventually what happened as a sort of byproduct, I guess, or like it's not really a byproduct because it wasn't unintentional, but is a community of audiences and interlocutors began to mirror back an image to the institution of an organization that actually has a kind of commitment to the environmental. And that in turn leads to the root system of the tree, the part you don't see, the slow, goodness me, sometimes very boring part too, which has to do with how do you change your own carbon footprint? How do you change your mission statement? How do you change your organizational structure? You know, and it's slow, and I don't have all the agency to do this without buy-in from everybody, you know. And there's also lots of different parts of the organizations that are trying to do the same, but through different entry points. How do you, and this was a really big one for me, every organization has in their mission statement something about sustainability and resilience. But when you look deeper, you find out that what they mean by sustainability and resilience more often than not has to do with the organization's own sustainability and the organization's own resilience. So I was interested in, like, can you bake into the structure of an organization? And it's not done, it's like work in progress. Can you bake into the structure of an organization, not just a mission that has to do with like presenting art, doing this, that, and the other within the context of the art field, but also an extended, like a entangled kind of extended field of responsibility that has to do with planetary, and I would say thrivability rather than sustainability, planetary justice and things like this. So that's that. And then the way that you can help do that is through that, which is the sideways, I guess, the mycelium network in the context of a forest, but all of those networked relationships across all of the different organizations and all of the different disciplines that have anything to do with ecology, because through sort of the exchange of skills and knowledge, through the mutual, through kind of collaborative programming, through, I guess, like mutual consultancy of different kinds, like I can offer you this and you can offer me like legal advice and all those kinds of things that are, in a sense, building a network around this intention.
Well, and you know, something I really also like about how you talk about this tree is how it resonates with so many cosmologies, like the Mayan. I'm in, like the Mayan cosmology, right, of the ceiba, with also has the where the root system and the branch system is as important, but also like say South Africa, the importance of it, but just generally even and so many parts of the world in different civilizations, the tree as a kind of gathering place, you know, as a social space, first and foremost. In an interview you've done, I loved reading how you say that unfortunately trees cannot curate, but since they can't, how can we curate with that in mind, right? And you know what you were talking about, as you were talking about institutions, I also I thought it could be a great transition to the third, my last question before Anne comes in to ask you some further questions, and it has to do with the current pandemic, right? Like how do you see all this work connecting? I mean, there's very obvious connections what can make, but I'd love to hear some that may be unusual in terms of, you know, we're of course it's a global crisis, right? As is climate change and the environmental topics you've been working on for all these years. But how has the pandemic, especially since you mentioned how it was a personal change that led you to the current work, how has the pandemic impacted what you do and how you think about work and life, you know?
So can I start by correcting myself and chastising myself for saying that trees cannot curate, because I think that was a big mistake looking back, and it follows me a lot, you know, that quote. Looking back, I've done a little bit of thinking about this, like, can they really not? And I think it comes down to, and bear with me here, because it's like really fresh thoughts that I'm still putting a shape around, but I think it comes down to, in the context of environmental justice and balance, in the context of a more than human entangled kind of practice, is decentering, is post-human, can we think of a different decentering of the human that is more in the shape of some kind of weird radical anthropomorphism? And what I mean by that is the unequal distribution of the climate catastrophe and the fact that it is literally stacked and built on top of those very same lines of colonial violence and of extraction. It's literally, it maps onto it one to one. Make it so that when we're talking about anthropocentrism, we're not actually talking about humans as a species. We're talking about a very specific kind of self-appointed, a specific group of self-appointed and actually humans with actually quite devastating consequences. And so to think a little bit differently and think more in line with like Marisol de la Cadena writing about earth beings in the context of the Andes and the kind of mutual making of earth beings being kind of mountains, the sort of the relational mutual making of people and mountains, for example. Instead of going, and you know, scientists say like, you shouldn't anthropomorphize a tree or whatever. I find it much more stimulating to think, well, what if to say that a tree is capable of, I don't know, love, generosity, humor, or even curating, let's say art, to say that that is anthropomorphizing a tree might perhaps actually be anthropocentric, in as much as, could we turn the whole thing around and assume that love, generosity, humor, and art in humans are emergences out of planetary versions of love, generosity, humor, and art, for example, but that just like we do with, I don't know, like a monotheistic old white man god, we create basically the categories of thought around our own image. And that is by doing that we disavow and foreclose the others, right? So to actually think like in a I suppose, de-anthropocentric way, but thinking in a de-anthropocentric way, but with a kind of climate justice head on, is not to descend to the human, is actually quite a humanist project, I think, and is one that so many sort of activists and organizations and communities are like, who are like, you know, there's no choice because it's like the forefront of that is like right there, are so much better at articulating than I just did. So that was just like about curating trees, curating. I think they probably do, but on the effect of the pandemic. So I think we probably, I'll just tell you very quickly about two things. One of them is that when all of the museums and galleries and exhibition spaces closed, and in London, they are still closed, many organizations that depended on footfall or like sublease of spaces on site, or like you know, catering income or shop income or whatever, had like some serious difficulties in terms of sustaining their activities or sustaining their staff or whatever, because they are built around this thing. And much of the Serpentine is built in quite the same way, except it has these 3 or 4 kind of strands that are not dependent on, that have never been dependent on existing within the actual physical exhibition space, and are much more distributed in the way that they operate. And I kept thinking, oh, like the General Ecology Project is trying to set the scene for a kind of emergent, at some point, prototype for a future of, you know, all these things. And then I realized, but maybe it just is. Like, maybe what it's doing is it's experimenting with different ways that art can exist. And I don't just mean on Zoom or like as a digital project on a website. I mean like exist in the context of like a climate conference, exist in the context of like a legal infrastructure, exist in the context of all these things. So we've started to work in a much more distributed way, and with all the partners in the network. And I should mention the Back to Earth project, because I feel like it's the one that we are most like learning the most from, and doing stuff that like a curator never, I don't think, has to do all that often. Because the Back to Earth project is a project that invited a number of artists, actually quite a lot, in true Hans-Ulrich Oberstdal, 65 artists, to propose something that is both an artwork, but at the same time is an environmental campaign. And that's kind of a trick, in a sense. I mean, the way that I would interpret it is that it's a trick to, how do you get an art organization to support an environmental campaign? Well, can you frame it around some kind of artistic kind of intention or framing? Does that then work? Can you like create this sort of performative moment in which you go, okay, so this is what we do. So, you know, the reality is we're really working deeply on maybe 10 and being really adherent to the needs of them. Some of them have to do with, you know, Caribbean Film Collective is developing an artist residency for ancestors, which de facto is a kind of indigenous run nature reserve in the Northern Territory of Australia, with which we have very little interaction. We're commissioning a film, but the film is sort of, there's like a whole process by which that film is facilitating the development of that. Others have to do, are much more on the kind of visual, sort of awareness raising bits. Others are completely infrastructural and you will never see them. And in working on those, finding ourselves in a pandemic context, stimulated us to actually think even more strategically about like, okay, so who are the partners that can now help us work on something? So the latest example, we're collaborating with We Present, which is the editorial platform of We Transfer, all those wallpapers, and highlighting 5 artist projects who each have nominated a nonprofit to whom donations can come. And so because millions of people see these wallpapers at the back, we're actually de facto sort of, you know, like the art organization puts itself in a kind of in-between place between the Climate Emergency Fund receiving funds from the public and from We Present, with an artwork kind of doing a little bit of something in the middle without instrumentalizing the artwork at all. The aim is for all those things to kind of manifest at once, I guess.
No, and that, I mean, in fact, I think 2 weeks ago we had Trevor Schoonmaker talk about, the last thing we talked about with him was Carrie Mae Weems' COVID-19 awareness campaign, that which was an artwork, but it's also a direct messaging campaign, but, since we have only a little bit over 20 minutes left, I want to make sure you started talking about museums and trends, right? How they're transforming themselves in this context, but even beyond COVID. So, Anne, I know you have some comments and questions. I will step back and let you two talk.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, since we are talking about institutions, I'm going to ask what was going to be my last question first, which was around a point you made in a recent interview where you mentioned that in a perfect future, you would open ecology departments in every arts institution in the world. So my question, which I loved, so my question was, in that scenario, how would you imagine things might change in terms of how institutions worked if they all had that department, and what new possibilities might arise?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure that it was a hope that there would be, not that I would be working on it, because that is just a lot of work. But so the first thing that I probably have to say, well, and obviously Tate is such a big example of making that massive change in terms of like making a commitment to climate neutrality, for instance. But I think one of the things that made this particular experiment function was the fact that I'd spent so much time working at the Serpentine years before, that it meant that the processes and mechanisms and like the paths of least resistance and the the ways to use budget and like a clever, like that, all those things had become kind of second nature. So instead I was trying to think of like, well, what is a relationship outside of the, like, I've been at this institution for a really long time now, I'm averse to change or whatever. What is actually the way that that very same fact of having been at the institution for a really long time can actually bring about forms of small change? So I would say like step one would be to be like super adherent to how it is, and then like insert these kind of, I used to say viruses, how bad is that? Insert these kind of like tiny protocols that might just like bloom in a sense. And in terms of like how might, what was the second part of your question? Because it was brilliant.
What possibilities might arise if arts institutions across the world had a similar department?
Well, I mean, I'm really interested in like, in also like what the perception is at the level of like organizations that work with climate justice or environmental balance or biodiversity, whatever it might be. What do those organizations tend to think that art does exactly? And more often than not, it's like making data, whatever, beautiful, powerful, poignant, horrible, like visualizing data in a particular way, like making it fleshy somehow. And that I think is really important. And to a certain extent, it's what happened with the Venice piece, this like bringing it to bear, But there are so many other things that so many generations actually of artists have been doing, even sometimes when they're not being an artist, that are potentially like completely transformative in the long run. And on top of it, art being this like thing that has existed throughout deep time in all civilizations holds, there's no time to talk about all this, but like holds deep cultural memory about our relationship with the planet. Like Sumerian poetry was all about agriculture. Like the deeper you go, the more you realize that it holds memory. And so we've started to see as this like, at worst, like a luxury or an annex or something like this. In other circumstances, I don't mean us who are dedicating our lives, but as like a kind of communication strategy or whatever, as opposed to this like super resilient technology that we've come up with that hold memory for the things that we learn as a species about our relationship with the planet. So it's like, so in the best of cases, actually, if the whole of the kind of let's say the whole perspective shifted, then it might be that actually art would be perceived in a different way as well. from the outside, potentially.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
As part of the Back to Earth podcast, there have been several discussions that also relate to wider artistic and social and cultural discussions at the moment, where you mentioned the importance of decolonizing the ecological field. And I wondered if you could speak more about that idea and how that influences your thinking and working practice.
It's a very important question that I think we ask ourselves all the time, particularly because, so let me start from the easier answer. The ecological field and ecological activism field has had traditionally quite a lot of blind spots, particularly around the notion of conservation, because embedded or baked into the notion of conservation is the fact of some kind of untouched land. But actually, a lot of the time, to call a piece of land untouched was a political project of colonization in order to disavow the actual real existence and coexistence between peoples and more than human species on those very lands. And the fact that you couldn't immediately perceive the destructiveness of the human species in relation to the more than human species was just because of relationships of care and reciprocity. It was specifically because of that. But I also am quite conscious of the fact that just like there is a kind of, just like we know about the extraction of rare earth material, the sort of sudden emergence of, Silicon Valley talking about indigenous wisdom traditions is also not, we need to be quite sort of mindful of not doing to ideas the same things that are doing to sort of mountains and lands and rivers. So I'm not the person who should, I'm the person who, I'm trying to be accurate to the situation. It wouldn't be untrue to speak about ecology without speaking about racism, or without speaking about colonialism, or without speaking about extraction, or without speaking about indigenous land restitution, or anything like this. It would be inaccurate.
Yeah.
But there are organizations that are working on those specific issues, like Wretched of the Earth, like all of the kind of I suppose indigenous rights organizations the world over, and so on, and artists who are committed to those projects. And I guess the responsibility that we have is to, particularly through Back to Earth, as we work with, say, for instance, Caribbean Film Collective, the responsibility that we have is to just support the project in the exact needs of the project and platform it, but in the exact ways that, as opposed to thinking in the other way, which is like, I commission you this thing and you send me this artwork. But it's like, what does it, I'm building, it's so funny, I wish I could share it with you, but like I'm building a sort of mock-up website for the Caribbean on time for the We Present. So it's like all this other work that's going on at the same time. And yes, there'll be a film at the end of it. But I got lost. But yeah, those are, I think it's a very, and then I should also say that the work of, for example, the Edgware Road Project, which is now turning into other strands and other long-term projects of my colleagues, Amal Khalaf and Elizabeth Graham, which is like, has been dedicated to decolonizing institutions, the rights to the city, neighborhoods, social justice and civic justice, are also projects that are really long-standing and that in a sense, set the parameters of how you work on these long research-based, how you code divestment into certain. So there's, I'm still learning from those things.
I'm conscious that we need to
carried away.
Time for questions from the audience, but I have one. I'll ask one more question, perhaps, which relates to what you were just saying, and it kind of connects your work in general ecology and all the programs associated with that, but also your work as part of a curatorial team in the Shanghai Biennale, where you refer to the importance of infrastructural thinking in terms of creating space for practices of care, which actually you just mentioned now, and giving and receiving space. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about how in general ecology, but also in the Biennale that's now, how that's affected the format and your thinking about time and programming and flow.
You mean how infrastructural thinking has affected?
How you create spaces for, kind of giving, practices of care, giving things time, perhaps in a way that none of us would have done before. The pandemic hit, and you can alter the time scale of a program or a biennial or the frequency of something, or you can have a multi-year project like you do with through general ecology, for example, where you can go really deep into something, which is still, I think, quite rare.
It's a strange miracle that happened with something like Back to Earth or the General Ecology Project, because the pandemic is definitely not the miracle, but this idea that all of a sudden there was a kind of different agency or different framework where there didn't used to be. One of the things I think I can probably answer from the point of view of commissioning, certainly, which is it occurred to me, and maybe this also emerged out of the experience in Venice. Performance is super expensive, as you know, and the research and development period of a piece of, say, choreography has this financial framework which allows for it to be, for a company to develop a piece for a year, survive during that year, and then show the piece, for example, for it. Those frameworks don't, by and large, exist in the art world. We invite artists for performances, but at best there's a fee for doing the performance, but very rarely is there some kind of longer. So learning, having had a little bit of experience of touring now with Sun and Sea, which is still going to tour for a couple of years, I think, led me to think about this, and lots of organizations, lots of people do it. This is not new, but it made me just think about it. Like the box, let's say the box of the art organization, which commissions a work, and let's say that the box is the organization and the work is the thing inside.
Yeah.
If you turn around that and the box becomes like a chunk of the artist's or collective's life, and then the life, like a project, a really long project with lots of different outputs, lots of time, and then the responsibility of the institutions actually become the pieces underneath that prop up that slice of time, then you have a different model, like a financial model where you're co-commissioning. But then the other unintended, but actually quite cool consequence of all of this is that you end up reducing expenditure of resources, financial, but also material, and multiplying your audience, because essentially the work is then presented in lots of different contexts and audiences that you never thought you could even have, and then encourage or make it possible for a practitioner who might be so inclined to work for a longer period of time on a bigger thing, rather than spread themselves thin on like 750,000 things for £300 kind of thing. Which stresses me out even to just think about it, because it's a little bit all of our lives as we work.
Thank you so much.
In terms of comments, Brigitta Rimkute, is very excited. She actually saw the piece in Venice, and you already answered that it will continue to tour. So that was her question, whether it will keep touring. So Kim is asking, generally speaking, like whether administrators and managers have been impacted, or if it has grabbed the attention of them, the type of work that you do, but also what advice you have for performing artists that are entering the visual arts, as in terms of that professional divide that still exists. And Helen Colton basically is bringing up rhizome philosophy from the 70s and how it can resonate with what you're doing, with general ecology. And Elizabeth Brown wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about race. I mean, I think she posted the question before you directly already addressed the connection between race and some earlier versions of environmentalism. But so I'll leave it at that and let you two keep talking, and I'll add others.
So we shouldn't answer those yet, or
no, you can. Yeah. The ones that I've listed, you can.
Okay. Are
comment
they
on them?
Sorry, because I can't remember them all. Are they the questions that I see on the Q&A?
Most, yes, they are the ones that, so it's Elizabeth Brown asked you to talk about race, the connection between race and climate justice, and then So Kim is about performance. Let's just stick to those two for now, like performance.
Should we stick to this?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for the question. Given the fact that you may have asked it before, I think again, to say it would be inaccurate to run an ecology program that did not acknowledge the fact that like racism, colonialism, and environmental destructions are stacked. Now, there are 3 projects at the Serpentine that end up meeting in different points, but that don't start from the same beginning point. Social justice, inequality, and racism on the part of my civic colleagues, advanced technology and kind of ethical, ethical interventions in technology on the part of my digital colleagues, and I suppose the ecological on the part of the General Ecology Project. They come to intersect in a complex enough tangle, which I think is the tangle of the intersectional complexity of these things. That means that the areas and fields of like specific research and expertise are different, and mine is not the history of like decolonial and post-colonial thought or anti-racist thinking. I will just come. I'm also like a white woman who should not be in a position of making claims on behalf of the project that I'm running. To address racism in any comprehensive way. I do, however, think that it would be inaccurate for the project not to address it. And so one of the futures I'm hoping for the General Ecology Project is to actually become a lot more networked and a lot more distributed. This is work very much in progress, so forgive me for being a bit vague. But the idea is that then those networks of organizations and individuals that come together around specific kind of pilot projects that really look at like one specific thing, around like legal notions of personhood, but also race and ecology. And that I would like to do that work together with my colleague Amal Khalaf, who has the expertise and brings all of that work of the Serpentine. I hope I answered your question, but I really want to answer it genuinely. So if you feel that I didn't, please do intervene in the.
I will also jump in and add Alvaro Pineda Paiva is writing from Brazil, and he says that he's an art student and that many students there are producing ecological artworks, but their problem is that they don't speak English, So and he had already asked about the role of language in this effort of decolonized art institutions. Directly, I wanted to mention to Alvaro, I mean, you I hope can answer to him, but also Alvaro should know that we're, in a few weeks, we have Jose Roca, whose Sydney Biennial will focus on a lot of these issues. And if Portuñol or Spanish is good, we can definitely talk at that event. But also Miguel Lopez, he and I agreed that when he visits this series, he will speak entirely in Spanish. So we'll have one event where English goes second tier deliberately and intentionally. So it's definitely a topic that matters a lot. And so I wonder if you two have ideas about this issue of language.
I mean, only to say that that's absolutely correct. 100%.
The Amogelang Maledu, I hope I pronounced your name right, has a question about collecting artworks, especially environmental artworks, and all the challenges that come with that. And working in South Africa, with increasingly shrinking budgets and blasé attitudes about the creative economy, that in connection of collecting the object that has inherent valuable or sacred precious status becomes like a big challenge. So how do you address this?
I think, Anne, this is maybe a better question for you. I've never worked for an institution that collects art, so that has a collection, so I have no idea.
Yeah, I'm totally not supposed to be here to talk about that. more representing the past journal. But it is a really good question, and perhaps it relates to a question I was going to ask you actually. So maybe that's an interesting connection, where the projects that you've been doing in Back to Earth, you're opening that up to so many different fields, more than 60 artists, architects, poets, filmmakers, thinkers, and designers, to devise these artist-led environmental campaigns or initiatives that will, in some cases, of course, result in artworks that tackle these kinds of issues. And I just wondered if, so far, have there been any? It's an amazingly rich invitation, and as with a lot of the way you work, you're mixing disciplines and you're opening up the space for collaboration. Have there been some surprises in there? Have there been some challenges? Like, how will these feed into the learning, if you like, of Serpentine's thinking moving forward?
Surprises, yeah, quite a lot, and also kind of co-learning, I guess, because it's a very strange invitation to, I mean, it's not strange for myriads of artists who've been working through those systemic things for their whole practice. But when you're asking an artist who actually doesn't, who has a deep commitment, maybe in a different part of their life, but hasn't to that point brought those two things together, then you do a lot of co-learning, a lot of, I guess, again, this question of how are you as adherent as possible to the needs of that particular project? I think I've learned, I mean, really, I've learned all kinds of super bizarre things, from, what the best in, or well, I don't know if it's the best, but what kind of infrastructures for collecting donations for NGOs, to, the botanical properties and relationships with local pollinators of a specific areas of species, to, how to, also these kind of strange language gaps, translation gaps between disciplines that happen, that you find that strategically, to make something happen, you actually have to present it like a pitch in the shape of a startup. And how do you make those translation gaps actually more, how do you surface those so that they become tools that you can kind of perform, in a sense, in different contexts? So one of the future works of the General Ecology Network part will be to really think about those translation and knowledge gaps between the art way of talking about things and the oceanographer's way of talking about things and the impact investor and all of these kinds of, and sometimes you just come across political difference, and that's fine. Sometimes you just, that's it. But the kind of the more subtle places in which you can meet also with some difference, but with a few shared aims, all these kinds of weird strategic, in a moment in which politics is really divided, really divisive, really kind of algorithmically led to fighting and all of this, how do you surface the moment of that, and also learning about building distributed governance systems, all this kind of weird work that I never thought I would be doing.
It's amazing.
I think, I've passed a lot of the comments into the answers so that everybody can see them. There's some great comments of people who actually witnessed, Sun and Sea, so you can read them there. But I will introduce a last comment because we have to wrap up soon. But I think it really illustrates how the devil's in the details, and it makes me think of the image you presented of the roots of the institution, right? That they're invisible, and it's from Usha Sehjarim. I often think about how the art world addresses environmental issues through content, but the irony of environmental ignorance in the form of extensive carbon footprint and travel, for example, doesn't make sense. The enormous amount of plastic used in packaging artwork, bubble wrap, right? I think a lot of more curators these days are thinking about this question, right? Like yourself, but also Jose Roca moved to Sydney. We'll hear from him in a few weeks. He moved to Sydney with his family so that the carbon footprint gets reduced, and he's very deliberately going to reduce travel, you know, and for also for artists and so on. So how do you think, and as we finalize the conversation, those details? I mean, you've talked about in other contexts about the overlap, but also the difference between environmental activism and the art, you know. So with something like bubble wrap, what do you see? Like, is it really just the invisible part, or can we make it the visible part as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should probably say that on specifically the carbon footprint part of this whole thing, there are some really amazing organizations. Like in the UK, there's an organization called Julie's Bicycle, whose entire kind of mission is to provide tools for art organizations. They started in music to reduce their carbon footprint. So they provide these tools so that you can count it. They advise on all kinds of matters. So they have this kind of placement, change from the inside ethos. And I think they're doing a fantastic job, and not something that the General Ecology Project, for example, has set itself the task to do, only because it wouldn't be able to do it any better. But supporting the work that Julie's Bicycle do and collaborating with them on anything that we might think of is obviously one of those intentions. Like, I completely agree on travel and materials and waste and all of this. And I really am glad that it came up. It was surfaced at some point. I have this feeling that much of the art world, you know, artists have been working on this for ages, but much of the art world, particularly art institutions, you know, there's a hesitation in talking about things that you can't necessarily, that you're not fully blameless in, right? But now I seem to see a lot more of a kind of, well, we're not perfect, but we're going to take this step and that step, and you know, this kind of interim in between being like squeaky clean and being a mess, but like not talking about it. And so I think it's like in that space that you can actually start to make those kinds of honest, you know, attempts. I can't speak to, like, I've very rarely worked with objects, so I don't know so much. But one of the things, for example, that we did with the Venice piece was to work with the city of Venice so that the sand from the stage become a number of play spaces for children in a city that is notoriously terrible for having young kids. So we were trying to think a little bit, like, you make a few of those attempts to think through. At the same time, the lighting was super energy heavy, so we never found some kind of like a perfect version of this, but we were trying to think about different ways of thinking through this notion of like thrivability. Like, can it turn into something else, or can it, you know, it's an imperfect answer, but to a very good question.
And did you want to add something to it, or?
Just to support really what was just said in terms of, at least in the UK, I'm not so sure about you know, other areas, but certainly the organization that you mentioned is one of the ones that is key and driving a lot of change in the UK and across museums and galleries right now. So it's a really interesting one to look at if people haven't heard of it.
Well, and I think it may be a good note to end on, and it's something maybe a lot of us identify with what you said about being neither squeaky clean nor a total mess. Hopefully, maybe of us feel like a total mess right now in pandemic times. But thanks so much, Lucia. It was wonderful to talk, and I think I hope a lot of people will keep following your work. And as you said, and there's so much more we could talk about, so many great questions that your work brings up. And thanks, Anne, for joining us as a responder.
It's a pleasure.